Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Herbert Hoover, and the focus is first-year agenda. Year is 1928. Hoover is now the president-elect of the United States, but before taking his oath of office, he decided to take a little break, to take a trip with some colleagues and with his wife Lou to Latin America, kind of a goodwill tour. He said in Honduras, "In our daily life, good neighbors call upon each other as the evidence of solicitude for the common welfare, and to learn of the circumstances and point of view of each, that there may come both understanding and respect. This should be equally true among nations." And he offered a bit of an olive branch, trying to back away a bit from the more intrusive Theodore Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which is kind of getting into the business sometimes of these Latin American countries. Hoover was somewhat repudiating that, and he also said, as a goodwill gesture, as soon as practical, he was going to remove American troops, which had been in Nicaragua and in Haiti, kind of peacekeeping forces there. He was going to get them out as soon as practical. Well, one of the practical decisions Herbert Hoover had to do as president-elect was his cabinet, and he decided to retain two folks who had actually been around for the last 8 years under Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge. Andrew Mellon would stay on for another term as the Secretary of the Treasury, James Davis in the Labor Department, but he also, of course, had new folks, including political operatives like Henry Stimson, who was going to be his Secretary of State. He had a friend, Ray Wilbur, his friend from Stanford, the president of the university. He got to step down from that position to take over as Secretary of the Interior, and some American tradition, a scion of the Adams family, Charles Francis Adams III, taking over at the Navy Department. The presidency for Herbert Hoover not only is the first elective office he'd ever held, it's the first time he'd ever run for office. He was confident going in, but leery a bit of high expectations from the American people. He said, "I have no dread of the ordinary work of the presidency. What I do fear is the result of the exaggerated idea the people have conceived of me. They have a conviction that I'm some sort of Superman, that no problem is beyond my capacity. If some unprecedented calamity should come upon the nation, I would be sacrificed to the unreasoning disappointment of a people who expected too much, a fateful prophecy to be sure." Well, Inauguration Day came, and Hoover met with Calvin Coolidge, the outgoing president, at the White House. They went to the Capitol together, where Hoover then made his inaugural address after taking his oath of office. It was a positive, optimistic, kind of made in the USA set of remarks. "In the large view, we have reached a higher degree of comfort and security than ever existed before in the history of the world," Hoover said. "Through liberation and from widespread poverty, we have reached a higher degree of individual freedom than ever before. We are steadily building a new race, a new civilization, great in its own attainments." He focused mainly on domestic policies, a very policy-filled address typical for Hoover, but he didn't neglect foreign affairs either in this post-war world. He said that it is impossible, my countrymen, to speak of peace without profound emotion. In thousands of homes in America, in millions of homes around the world, there are vacant chairs. It would be a shameful confession of our unworthiness if it should develop that we have abandoned the hope for which all of these men died. Surely civilization is old enough, surely mankind is mature enough, so that we ought to, in our lifetime, to find a way to a permanent peace. Of course, this was not to be. The inaugural for Herbert Hoover took place in a pouring rain. He decided to keep himself and Lou in an open car on the way back to the White House despite the rain, so he could wave and connect with the American people. Got back to the White House and he was completely drenched, changed his clothes and presided over the inaugural parade. But since he didn't dance, he didn't go to the inaugural ball that night. He went to a charity event instead, which was fitting since, as in his entire public career, he had always donated his salary to charity, and he would do the same with his presidential salary. Herbert Hoover expected to be busy as president, and he broke some traditions. In fact, he hired not one, but 3 secretaries. No president had ever done that before. They'd always gotten by with one. He's also the first to install a telephone in the Oval Office, all part of being more efficient, which was in the DNA of Herbert Hoover. Now, Lou Hoover was the one who made the home wherever they were around the world. She would do that in the White House as well. She was an active first lady, but mostly behind the scenes, and that's the way the Hoovers wanted it. She was involved in a lot of charitable work, including with her beloved Girl Scouts, which she continued to be very involved in, but most of her charity work was done anonymously. They avoided the public's eye when it came to the Hoover family. Lou Hoover also did some renovations in the White House, in particular the Lincoln Study that Theodore Roosevelt had actually turned into a bedroom for his children. Lou Hoover wanted to return that to where it was in a picture that she saw when Lincoln had his cabinet together for signing the Emancipation Proclamation. And she used that picture as a model. In fact, Hoover himself was a big fan of Lincoln, and he loved to tell that story when he'd have small gatherings of guests in the Lincoln Study to tell about Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation in that room. Now, Herbert Hoover would work constantly. He'd always had in his life, no change here in the presidency, have very few vacations, but he also understood he needed to get away occasionally. And so he and Lou sought out some kind of retreat, a place in the outdoors that they could get away, perhaps on weekends. And they found their spot on the Rapidan River, about 100 miles away in the state of Virginia. They decided to build 13 cabins to create this retreat, and they would actually spend most weekends when they were in Washington, D.C. at the Rapidan camp, mostly with very close friends. Hoover would still work a lot of times on those weekends, but he would take some time out to fish or take some hikes in the great outdoors. But again, work was still the major part of the presidency of Herbert Hoover. He was full speed ahead on an aggressive agenda in this first year, taking a number of ideas from his days as Secretary of Commerce and trying to bring those to kind of a new level. But he always had his principles. For example, he had a different reaction on what to do on water management, which was a major topic of interest of him from his days at Commerce. He was all for this new dam, a massive dam that's going to be built on the Colorado River right outside of Las Vegas in Nevada. It's going to serve 6 states, hydroelectric power. And this was a fitting role for the federal government. It was addressing interests of multiple states, and also the capital investment needed for this kind of public work made perfect sense. But Hoover was against what the people in Alabama wanted, which was to expand the role of the Muscle Shoals power plant on the Tennessee River here in Alabama. They wanted to get into the distribution business of power, not only generating power, but also distributing it. And Hoover thought this was wrong. That's something that the private sector could do. You didn't need federal hands in the distribution business. So when bills along those lines came to his desk, he was quick to veto them. Another major topic, Prohibition. The 18th Amendment had been around for the last 5 years, and Hoover knew it wasn't really working, primarily because the states and municipalities were not enforcing the law prohibiting the sale, consumption of alcohol. And he realized that there was crime that was sort of running rampant. You had organized crime with speakeasies operating with impunity in most of the major cities around the country. But Hoover's confronted, what are you going to do about this? And he said, look, there's a bottom line here. I took an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. This is a constitutional requirement. We will implement it here as best we can. Our country has deliberately undertaken a great social and economic experiment, he said, noble in motive and far-reaching in purpose. It must be worked out constructively. He's going to do his best to enforce that amendment, but he also knew it was kind of a losing effort without those states and municipalities doing their fair share of the role. Now, economically, the 1920s had certainly roared. It was the most productive and prosperous decade in American history for most of the country, except really for farmers. The farmers had always lagged in this era of prosperity, primarily because they continued to have excess supply. That led to low prices. That led to no profits. Now, Hoover and the Republican platform running in the campaign had said, we're going to offer something for the farmers, increased protection. They're going to look to raise the tariff rates on agricultural products to provide some protection for the farmers. And so Hoover agreed to call a special session of Congress to focus on this task. The problem is when you call a special session of Congress, it's hard to control the Congress, and that was the case here. Hoover wanted protection just for the farmers. The Senate, a lot of protectionists there, they wanted protection for a lot more than that. And the bill that emerged from the Senate added protection for 20,000 products, many of them not agricultural products, and the tariff rates, the second highest ever in the country, were being proposed. Now, over 1,000 economists, including 7 7 from Hoover's Stanford University, also dozens of foreign countries, all lobbying the president veto this bill. It's going to lead to retaliation. This is not what you signed up for. But Hoover was conflicted, because there were two elements in this bill that he actually really wanted. One was the protection for the farmers. The second was a flexibility provision by creating a commission in the executive branch that would have the authority to raise or lower tariffs by 50% on their own. This was key to Hoover. He said, no provision for flexible tariff, the no tariff bill. Progressive advance gives great hope of taking the tariff away from politics, lobbying, and log rolling. That's the piece that he really wanted. Well, the debate on called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff took over a year, but eventually that bill came to his desk. He decided to sign it. A number of foreign countries retaliated right away. This would reduce the imports, the competition with domestic farmers, but it also reduced exports, and the overall impact of the bill yet to be determined. Another thing for the farmers he did was a farm bill that created a $500 million fund to create loans to encourage cooperative marketing of farmers, give them a better opportunity as a group to react to changes in supply and demand. These weren't handouts, it was loans, but it was something that Hoover was looking to do to help the farmers. Foreign policy. Hoover was around the previous decade as Secretary of Commerce watching President Warren Harding pursue the greatest disarmament deal really in the history of the world, focusing on large naval ships. He wanted to maybe do something similar to that, possibly help not only encourage peace, but also to save money. Hoover became the first American president to host a prime minister of Britain in the United States. Ramsey MacDonald came, and actually they met at the Rapidan camp, that outdoor retreat for Hoover, about 100 miles from the White House. This is October 4th of 1929, and they were negotiating amongst themselves in advance of a conference scheduled for London later on in the following year. The idea was to expand the limits on production of naval vessels to include submarines, heavy cruisers, destroyers, even some of the smaller vessels beyond what was covered in the agreement that was negotiated by Harding the decade before. So when that conference finally met, Britain was on board, United States on board, and Japan was on board. Italy and France, who were at the conference, refused to sign. They're very worried about Germany rearming. They didn't think that they were in a position to commit to reducing or limiting their size of their navies, but it was an agreement that was put forward to the United States Senate. It passed 58-9. Hoover said it will mark a further step toward lifting the burdens of militarism from the backs of mankind. Again, optimistic, but this would be the last agreement before Germany and Japan would begin to rearm in just a few years. The focus of Hoover's presidency, of course, was about to change for good. Couple of weeks into the month of October, after that meeting with Premier MacDonald, the Roaring Twenties came to an abrupt end. 1929 stock market crash, the onset of the Great Depression. Those are stories for another day. That is Herbert Hoover and his first-year agenda. From the life of Herbert Hoover, more Presidential Chronicles. Check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.